I will begin by introducing you both while you set up your thing. So first, Betlem Pallardó Azorín holds a degree in Hispanic Studies and a master's in Advanced Hispanic Studies, both from Universitat de València. She's currently undertaking her PhD as doctoral researcher at the Department of Spanish Philology at the Universitat de València, supported by the FPU, Formación de Profesorado Universitario grant, within the PhD program in Advanced Hispanic Studies, under the direction of Jaume Peris Blanes and Claudia Alonso Recarte. She's also a member of the editorial team of the academic journal Kamchatka, Revista de Análisis Cultural. And Janet Sid, PhD, is a Hong Kong-born, Toronto-based composer, sound artist, and music educator, currently based in San Diego. Her interdisciplinary practice explores ocean humanities, marine ecologies, and sound through acoustic, electronic composition, installation, and scholarly writings. Drawing on her background in scuba diving, zoology, and immigrant experiences, she engages decolonial and multi-species approaches through the themes of thinking through water, migrations, memories, and identities. So, if you two are ready, you can go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming. I would like to thank the organizing team for putting together this conference. It is really a pleasure to be part of it. We'd like to share our collaborative project. It's a sound art project. It is titled Echoes in Elsewhere. Before we listen to the piece, I will briefly explain its origins. Janet and I met in Scotland as a part of an environmental humanities program for early career researchers. We traveled together to Oban in the West Coast to dive and to record underwater sounds and videos. During one of those dives in the cold, dense waters of Galarach Reef, we experienced a brief encounter with a greater pipefish. Syngnathus acus is the scientific name. In that moment, our submerged bodies felt simultaneously entangled with and estranged from a radically other than human world. This encounter inspired a collaborative research creative project that integrates my field, literature, and her field, sound. I worked on the text, and Janet developed the sound composition. So the sound piece merges underwater and near-water field recordings and vocal gestures. So we're gonna listen to the piece. Do we have time to listen full? Yeah? Okay.
Go ahead.
Recobrir la pell, cepillar les vores, restringir el moviment. Vestits il·luminats, cremallera en diagonal, velcro, tancaments, ganxos que apreten, contenen, limiten. La part orgànica, recoberta d'artifici, retrocedix, sense fer. Però has après a respirar, a confiar en l'objecte que toquem, a fer del teu cos una altra cosa. Premis enrocada que t'agafa la bola, prefereixes la tos. La crema solar és prou aquí. Avances amb fortesa. És tan infinit. Vols saber què és? Anomenar-te, conèixer la captura del sentit del tronal. La terra és bruscament. De genolls observes l'espai oscil·lant, els colilles de l'herba un sentiment de la lluna. Inhales accelerada l'aire aspre, i agafes. És quasi groc, una trinxeta mínima i prima que s'envolta d'igual entre estats. Només el sud s'interromp en la nació tropical. En el pueblo existe bebé y pobres. Aquesta és una aigua. En el somni, és un cos esclapat, una fugida erràtica. Eres també un cos lleu que observa que deixa un ras fugida erràtica. Eres també un cos lleu que observa que deixa un ras fugida erràtica. Eres també un cos lleu que observa que deixa un ras fugida erràtica. Eres també un cos lleu que observa que deixa un ras el teu cos és igualment impulsiu. En el teu és interior. La gran capacitat havia salut d'una estructura potent de la biblioteca. El sol és dur, el sol és blanc. La praderia, la llar, el ruïna, el desordre, a fer del teu cos una altra paraula. Tens una altra paraula que t'agafa el vent. El tenim tot la pell. Podem trobar el cor aquí. Abans de contactar-te.
Thank you, Boem, for situating this collaborative research. I will be speaking about the sonic dimensions of this project. My research creative practice is grounded in the embodied and situated knowledge building, scales of relations and care, and taking human accountabilities in my more than human encounters. Our work aligns with the ocean humanities scholar, Melody Ju, in her media studies of what she calls milieu-specific analysis through the medium of water, to think, to perceive, to inscribe, to remember through water. Through cochlear and in-body listening practices and field recordings, I cultivate a creative practice that responds to and reflects on the acoustic experiences and the relationships of sounds and spaces at different scales. This approach considers the histories and the positionalities of underwater ecosystems, the human and more than human bodily encounters, and the human bodies who are submerged physically and metaphorically into these briny depths. There have been numerous artworks that are ocean-focused, from hydrophone field recording compilations to making music alongside animal sounds. But what happens when the listening and the sound-making practices are taken into the water and go through perceptual and conceptual reconfigurations and then brought back to land and air? Over multiple diving sessions, I come into an embodied underwater knowing. My body, with its sensory inputs, perceives, attunes, and responds to underwater sounds. I come to orient, to relate, to attune to the multi-species worlds around me. I notice how small shifts in depth, temperature, currents, and biodiversity elicit distinct physiological responses, territories, embodied memories, and speculative inquiring. As the concepts of boundaries, territories, or edges are immersed in water, their meanings expand, dissolve, and reconstitute. The ethnomusicologist and cultural anthropologist Stephen Feld writes in The Waterfalls of Song, a chapter from the co-edited book Senses of Place, the placing of auditory space is the dispersion of sonic height, depth, and directionality. Space-time inevitably sounds in and as figure and ground, as comingness and goingness. Feld's work with the indigenous Kaluli people of Bosavi, Papua New Guinea, reminds us that hearing is culturally attuned and in constant dialogue with vision. Quote, this is because much of the rainforest is visually hidden where a sound cannot be hidden, end quote. Underwater, this observation is expanded. Hearing, pressure, and memory cannot be hidden even when much of the ocean is visually obscured. How might these frameworks shift when I go underwater with my technological mediations? What memories or imaginaries might arise in my body as I descend slowly to 18 meters or lower? The most striking experience is the sudden intensification of multisensory input. Preparing for a dive is both a weighty and weighted process. My dry suit, my buoyancy control device, and my air tank can weigh nearly 45 to 50 pounds or more. I wobble when gracefully down the ramp. The water in Oban was cold and got colder as we descended towards the bottom of the sandy reef. So you could see in the picture earlier in the slides that I was very much encased in many layers of things. And when I was coming out of the first dive, I walked so slowly that the dive lead was making fun of me, saying that I was the slowest person that ever went up that ramp that she had seen. At just a few meters underwater, my ears feel the increasing pressure. The air from the regulator mouthpiece feels cold and dry. As I go further away from the surface, I feel gently and slowly squeezed like marinated chicken being packed into vacuum seal packages at the supermarket. In cold water ecosystems, my neoprene hood muffles sound. Still, I can hear the boat across the cove, the exhaled bubbles from Betlem and our dive leader, and the faint scrape when my gear brushes rock or kelp. Hearing happens through both ears and skin. The vibration of touch heightens my auditory awareness. I feel the grit of sand and the rubbing of my gear. I become aware of my limbs feeling heavier, the water feeling thicker, and my fin kicks requiring more effort. This slowing down washed my senses with a dreamlike haze, not unlike the hazy green waters in front of my diving mask. Through these underwater experiences, I am learning to listen to attune differently, not only with my ears, but with my whole body. I become fish-like in feeling pressure and movement along the length of my body, in adjusting air inside my suit like a fish adjusts their air bladders. I become seal-like as I stick my hand through the column of air bubbles from my dive companions. The sensations that surface as I explore this underwater ecosystem, multiple timescales and memories become fluid and accessible in ways I do not experience on land. These moments of attunement invite me to think about what it means to know with the ocean, rather than simply to know about it. The enormous sea lettuce sways very slowly, and the fishes move a little faster, and the small hermit crabs scuttle even faster. The greater pipefish blends in with the seagrasses and kelp fronds, but each of them live out different lifespans. The fishes flex their slender body in ways the seagrasses cannot and make intermittent adjustments or feeding. Blink, and I might miss their telltale movements. To observe and speculate on the pipefish lifespan, time, their relational scale to other reef inhabitants, space, and the histories of the water, memory, the rigidness of terrestrial references are revealed, disturbed, and settled. In this process, new aesthetic and experiential spaces for multi-species kinship and care can develop and flourish. These embodied encounters form the sensorial logics and methodological approaches of my sound installations, where first-person underwater field recordings and sound compositions are constructed to be liquid, multi-species, site-specific ecologies, striving to communicate and convey ways of thinking with and through water. The sound art component for Echoes and Elsewhere is an assemblage of field recordings and composed sounds, referencing and abstracting processes and events on different time scales. It is not intended to be linear, but an entangled rearranging of human and more than human elements, where the listener's attunement may guide the experience and meaning-making of the work. If a listener hears a seagull and the crash of waves, what sensations and memories may be elicited? Does the seagull sound lead to the listener picking on something similar or different after? Does the whooshing sound of the diver's fin elicit a sensation of something passing by the listener's arm? The acoustic world is folding, unfolding, refolding. and the listener can come into knowing and world-making through multi-layered, multi-scalar dimensions of embodied reconfigurations and reflections.
Thank you. As Janet explained very well, her sound practice attends to the auditory and physical disorientation and ways of knowing of the submerged human body. My own contribution to our project comes from a different but related place. As a philologist, I am trained in the structures through which humans organize meaning, such as syntax, grammar, naming, voice. After our dive in Oban, I was moved by our encounter with the pipefish, and I turned to these familiar tools hoping to make sense of it. I intended to narrate the dive with a realist tone, but the text that emerged from my practice was prose poetic. It was not a retelling, but an experimental exploration of the complex sensory and ethical aspects of the encounter. When diving, the body I usually comfortably inhabit is no longer fully available to me. Before the dive has even begun, I have already been sealed, weighed down, and reconfigured by the equipment. The neck and wrist seals of the dry suit press into my skin, as Janet documented here. The weight wears down on my hips until it feels like it might break through. I look at myself, then at Janet, who is also struggling. Encouraging each other, we waddle towards the shore. There is nothing graceful in our entry. Once submerged, my OK hand signals meets Janet's, and we start descending. I feel very frustrated that our communication is now reduced to a handful of rudimentary gestures. If the mermaid loses her voice on leaving the sea, the human loses theirs on entering it. This linguistic loss is important because long before I encounter the pipefish I will want to name, the medium has already disabled my bodily speech, and with it, one of the conditions that sustain human mastery and logocentric control. We descend slowly through the silted water. I am kneeling among the reef, still trying to control my buoyancy, when Janet points towards the seagrass. A thin, bright yellow line emerges between the stems. I move closer and find a pair of eyes unmistakably directed at me. I am being looked back at by a radically other being. My immediate impulse is to linguistically make sense of who I am seeing, to pin the individual to a word, a category, and a species. Back on land, I write down their scientific name and I gather the kind of information, taxonomic distributional, for example, that is supposed to make an unfamiliar being legible. But the more I learn, the further I feel from what happened in that brief exchange of gazes. This is the paradox of the taxonomic reflex. By classifying a living, breathing being, humans reduce them to a set of extractable data points that cannot contain their vitality. Making the more than human legible through human language enacts what Tabak identifies as an epistemological act of violence. So the question is, how can a diver ethically engage with other animals? Through my literary practice, I propose shifting our approach to this question in two ways: an inward turn towards our human responsibility and an outward turn towards the more than human's opacity. The first, building on Haraway, asks us to move away from the desire to capture the other and instead attune to them with openness and vulnerability. To truly respond to the pipefish, then, I had to let go of the demand for absolute knowledge, that is, my own epistemic comfort. The second shift draws on Glissant's right to opacity, which is the right that colonized people have to refuse the Western requirement of transparency, that is, the right to exist without being understood by the Western world. This ethical boundary, I argue, must also extend to the human gaze directed at the more than human lives. Our desire to understand them, our demand for transparency, that is, should be tempered by the right to remain opaque, that is, impossible to reduce to our human terms. From this perspective, I need to understand the pipefish's illegibility and obscurity not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a constitutive part of the encounter. Echoes in Elsewhere tries to enact these gestures. My recorded voice does not sound above the environment as a narrative anchor. It sinks into a medium that was never designed for it. Fragments of my speech enter the water-oriented sounds, sometimes fading in and out, and other times rupturing the surface abruptly. This is a way of practicing responsibility. I do not erase my intrusion into the riff, but I refuse to let it dominate the sonic space. As the bond between signifier and signified phrase, language becomes strained matter. What emerges then is a shared space of fragmentation and partial intelligibility. The listener is invited to sit within this friction, within the opacity of the word. The fact that the text is in Valencian, a minoritized language, adds to that opacity. With this integration of the text and the sound, we try to resist a common gesture in interspecies sound art, a human voice reciting over what is presented as pristine natural sounds. This is a compositional logic that, however well-intentioned, reinstates anthropocentrism. Instead, we seek to place the listener closer to our own experience of post-anthropocentric disorientation. A line repeated throughout the piece condenses this idea. At the end, the pipefish becomes the narrator and says, "Creurà conèixer-me. She will think she knows me." The sentence is directed at the diver, who surfaced, looked up the name, wrote it down. It is a subtle accusation against the futility of taxonomic capture. My literary practice wants to acknowledge this futility, to accept that the encounter cannot be closed nor tied to a meaning. Rather than forcing a reconciliation, the text closes with the slow recovery of the seagrass meadow after the diver's departure. Així, a poc, l'herba tornarà a adreçar-se. Here, little by little, the grass will rise again. To conclude, we'd like to highlight that our project doesn't intend to translate the pipefish into human terms. We do not want to offer the listener a stable, legible nature to consume. Instead, Echoes in Elsewhere ask you to sit within disorientation, opacity, fragmentation, reconfiguration. If the piece leaves you with more questions than answers, with sensations that resist being pinned down, then it has done its work. The pipefish, after all, continues their life without us, beyond us. Thank you.